Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Roads and Bridges webcast. Our topic today is the National Standard for Minimum Pavement Marking Retroreflectivity Levels, sponsored by ATSSA. I'm Ryan Curtis with Endeavor's Buildings and Construction Group. To begin, let me explain how you can participate in today's presentation. First, if you have any technical difficulties during today's session, simply type your issue into the Ask a Question box, and a member of our team will assist you. You can also click on the question mark Help button in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. Additionally, we welcome your questions during today's event. We will answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A session that will follow the main presentation, but please feel free to send in your questions at any time. To do so, simply type your questions into the Ask a Question box and click on the Send button. If you would like a copy of the presentation, please click on Event Resources on the side of your screen to download the presentation. Also, please be aware that today's session is being recorded and will be available on the Roads and Bridges website within the next week. You'll be notified by email when the archive is available. Now, let's meet today's speaker. Paul Carlson is the CEO of Automated Roads. He has over 25 years of experience in the transportation industry and an extensive background as a research engineer. Paul achieved a Ph.D. in civil engineering from Texas A&M University and currently serves on the boards and councils of the NCUTCD, SAE, and ATSSA. Now, let me turn things over to our presenter. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ryan, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the country. It's a pleasure to go over the final rule that has now been published in the MUTCD on pavement marking minimum retroreflectivity levels. I'll be spending the next 20 minutes talking about this, and I'll be happy to answer your questions at the end if you send them in, as Ryan explained. I'll also have some contact information at the end of these slides if you care to reach out with any additional questions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started on the presentation. This is a topic I know really well. I supported Federal Highway in developing the research that is behind this final rule and for much of the rulemaking period. I also did the same with the sign retroreflectivity rule as well. So this slide here is my title slide, of course, but it also shows you some details if you really wanted to dig down and look at the final rule. The final rule is published in the Federal Register, and that's a document that is published every day by the federal government. If you're looking for this one in particular, you're looking for volume 87, number 150, August 5th, 2022. There is a link at the bottom of the page that will take you directly to it. There are some confusions about this particular rulemaking regarding the MUTCD, and I want to try to address that. So what has happened is this final rule has been published as revision 3 to the 2009 MUTCD. And what's confusing about that is a lot of people, when this rule was published in August, heard of national dialogue talking about a new MUTCD. That is a different effort. It is still in the works. We're expecting a new MUTCD very soon in May 2023. But I want to be clear that this final rule was published in the 2009 MUTCD as revision 3. So it is in the MUTCD now. We do not yet have a new MUTCD. We're waiting for the next edition of the MUTCD, which, like I said, is expected in hopefully 60-ish days. Okay, so before I get much further into the presentation, I'd like to do a little engagement with the audience. I'm sure I know many of you or some of you, or you know me, but what I'd like to do is go ahead and publish this survey so that I get some feedback about who you are, what type of agency you're working with, whether that's local or state, or whether you're a consultant, whether you're in the industry, such as a pavement marking applicator. So I would like for you to just take a minute and click on the button that's most appropriate And I will share the results with you here in a minute. I think we have 45 seconds to complete the survey. And I am new to this, so hopefully this works well. Okay, so I see the results, but I'm not sure you do. I'm going to push them to the audience, and hopefully you get a sense of who else is listening in as well. So for the most part, it looks like we've got good representation with local and state agencies, consultants, industry. And when I say industry, I meant the pavement marking industry. So applicators, service providers that measure retroreflectivity. We've got a couple folks from academia and then other. So super, looks like we've got a broad representation, and hopefully that, that's very useful, because this final rule essentially applies to all roads open to public travel, with some minor exceptions I'll go over here. So now that we've got that underway, let's go and take a look at some background material. And what I'm trying to do here is just explain to you in a very quick way, why do we have minimum retroreflectivity levels now? And it all started with that first bullet. So the Appropriations Act of 1993, believe it or not, that is correct. In 1993, Congress required FHWA to develop a standard for minimum level of retroreflectivity that must be maintained for pavement markings and signs, which apply to all roads open to public travel. So if you're a local agency, state agency, or anybody that is operating a road open to public travel, eyes open, because this applies to you. So a little bit more background. We did complete I say we because I helped FHWA so much, but FHWA completed the first part of this in late 2007 when they published minimum levels for traffic signs. At that time, we were just focused on traffic signs. For a lot of reasons, that's an easier bite than pavement markings. After we completed the final rule for sign retroreflectivity, we started the research and all the other support that was needed to finally publish minimum retroreflectivity levels for markings, which you can see, and this is a repeat, was completed in August of 2022. So the MUTCD now has minimum retroreflectivity levels, and I will go over those with you. So this is what this is right out of the third edition of the 2009 MUTCD. And there's a lot of confusion here. And I think the easiest way to address the confusion is to show the language in the MUTCD. Because you hear people talk about this incorrectly all over the place. And so I just wanted to go to the source and let you read the source. So section 3A03 is where the details are. And a standard in the MUTCD is basically the shall statement. And so you can read here that agencies must implement a method designed to maintain retroreflectivity at 50 or above under dry conditions for longitudinal markings for roadways with speed limits of 35 or greater. So immediately you recognize, okay, if I have roads of 30 that are posted at 30 or below, that standard does not apply to me. So that's an important piece of this. Another important piece that people seem to mingle with the standard is the following guidance statement that says, hey, when I've got speeds of 70 miles an hour or greater, I should think about using 100 instead of 50. Okay, so that's an important aspect of it as well. I hear people say the minimum is 100. I hear people say the minimum is 50, and they don't include these other details, and that can be confusing to agencies. So I wanted you to be able to see some of this language and know where to go to study it and fully dig in deeply. So the next page of the MUTCD keeps on going with exceptions. And I'm going to go over some of these exceptions, but I do want to point out a couple before I do that. So I'm going to go down to paragraph 6. And paragraph 6 talks about some areas where markings may be excluded from the provisions, from the requirements. So the first one's a little tricky. It says markings where ambient illumination assures that markings are adequately visible. Well, geez, that is very subjective if you ask me, but that's the way it's worded. So in other words, where you have continuous roadway lighting, you may be able to disregard the standard, but you have to first ensure that your markings are adequately visible. There's different ways to do that. I don't have time today to get into the details. If you have questions about that, I'm happy to talk to you offline about it. The second part is just as equally important. Markings are streets or highways that have ADT of less than 6,000 vehicles per day. So if I've got a low speed roadway of 30 miles an hour or below, or I've got a low volume roadway with ADT less than 6,000, those are some important thresholds that seem to be missed by many people as they try to implement this particular final rule. Some other areas where exceptions are provided are continued on the following page of the MUTCD. And then also they like to talk about transverse markings are not included. Word, symbol, and arrow markings are not included. So essentially what we're talking about here are edge lines, center lines, and skip lines. Okay, so you don't have to worry about some of the other pavement markings out there. And maybe that doesn't mean that they're not important. They are, but the way FHWA interpreted Congress's requirement, they only implemented this for longitudinal pavement markings. So here's another important aspect. This comes right out of the MUTCD as well, and I'm looking at revision 3 towards the bottom of this slide showing a table of compliance dates. And so it says here that agencies have 4 years from the effective date of this revision of the MUTCD. So the effective date of the revision is 30 days after it was published. So that becomes September 6th, 2022. So essentially what we're talking about, agencies have until September 6th, 2026 to implement a method designed to maintain pavement marking retroreflectivity level at 50, or if they choose, at 100 for high-speed roadways. Okay, so now that we've covered that, compliance means agencies must implement a method to maintain retro. It doesn't mean you have to hit 50 for every line in your agency. It means you have to have a method in place designed to maintain pavement marking retro. And out of all the possible ways to do that, and this on the bottom of this page is a reference to the report that FHWA published that goes into all these different ways and ways that you can evaluate pavement markings today that FHWA deemed not appropriate. And I don't have time to go through those today either, but it's all in this document. So out of all the ways to assess pavement marking retro, FHWA deemed these methods as being appropriate for this final rule. And I'm going to help you understand these a little bit more in the time remaining, but I won't have enough time to get into the weeds. So you've probably heard a lot of people say, if you really want to manage something, you've got to measure it. And I've heard FHWA say that about many things. The only way to really measure retroreflectivity is to get out on the road and measure it with a handheld or mobile equipment. And I'll share with you some evolution of retroreflectivity measurement equipment so that you know what's out there and what's available today. Another way is what FHWA calls consistent parameters method. And this is a method where an inspector is in the vehicle, ideally not the driver. The inspector is at least 60 years old, and they are looking at the pavement markings as somebody drives them around at night with low beam illumination and judging whether or not they are adequate. So a lot of subjectivity, as you can imagine. Calibrated markings method is also a visual inspection method. The inspector can be any age in this case, and they begin the night by looking at a few lines of known retro and trying to remember how bright those lines look at, say, the lines are 50 and 100, and then go out and drive the rest of the inspection route that night and try to compare what they're seeing to the markings they looked at initially. Or maybe they look at those markings repeatedly through the night. I don't know. There's not a fixed procedure, but as you can imagine, subjectivity might apply to that as well. Another one is called service life based on historical data. And these are for agencies that have been measuring retroreflectivity and keeping track of when the lines went down, what the initial retroreflectivity was, and how much retroreflectivity is lost per year or per time. And they have to consider, do I have snow plows on that road? Do I have how much traffic do I have on that road? What type of bead packages went down? There's lots of information to really make that work. But if you have it, you can use that and say, okay, well, I know that, a particular pavement marking material with a particular combination of drop-on beads is going to get me 3 years of retroreflectivity at or above 50. So I'm going to restripe my roads every 3 years, and I really am not going to measure anything. If you don't have the historical data, FHWA provides a method called service life of monitored markings. And this is essentially giving you an opportunity to develop that over the 4 years preceding being in compliance. So if you wanted to do that, you could start now by saying, okay, I've just installed, 3 different roads with 3 different pavement marking packages, or, maybe you're an agency that only uses one package, but you want to look at how the retroreflectivity deteriorates as a function of ADT. You could start to develop your own database. And that's what that method is. And then they also have a final one called other methods for new technologies or completely different out-of-the-box ideas. And it's up to you as an agency to deem whether or not you feel like that's a comfortable method for you to defend in court, essentially, if tort was ever a future concern of yours. So you would have to be comfortable defending a new method in court, which is not out of the question at all. It's just that, maybe new technologies down the road are better than any of these. So that gives you some really brief example of the methods that you could use. And again, the 4-year compliance period is for a method for an agency to be deploying and implementing a method. It doesn't necessarily mean all the markings in your jurisdiction have to be at 50 or above. It means you have to have a method, and you should probably have that method documented. Okay, so I just sort of have this summary slide, and it covers some material I've already mentioned, but some other material that is more difficult to capture. So first and foremost, the 50 and the 100 that are in the final rule, I want to be clear. Those are based on the nighttime visibility needs of a typical older driver. And the way we did the study, we deemed that driver to be based on the eyesight capabilities about a 62-year-old driver. The second thing is, and I've mentioned this is longitudinal pavement markings only, the white and yellow. So when I say 50 and 100, that applies to both white and yellow. So The 50 is the standard, and that 50 applies to both colors. And the 100 is a guidance level, but it is meant to apply to both colors as well. Now, agencies have the freedom to go above and beyond, and many agencies already have minimum retroreflectivity levels for pavement markings that are well above 50. So, and that's fine. That's absolutely perfectly fine. And as a matter of fact, I would encourage agencies to use something above these levels in the MUTCD. One, to give them a little cushioning, but also because these numbers were derived under the most ideal conditions. They don't include wet roads. They don't include a lot of visual complexity in the nighttime scene. I would encourage agencies to think about implementing higher levels. They only apply to nighttime dry conditions. They don't apply to wet conditions. I mentioned this, but I wanted to repeat it. Low speed roads and low volume roads may be excluded if that's what your agency chooses to do. It doesn't mean you have to exclude them. I find it interesting that FHWA provides relief if there's continuous roadway lighting, but no relief if raised retroreflective pavement markers are used, which significantly provide excellent nighttime guidance for motorists. The other thing to recognize is that these numbers were derived from older driver visibility needs. There is absolutely no consideration currently of the automated vehicle technologies, whether it's what we see on the road today, which is called ADAS or level 2 autonomy as defined by SAE, or ADS, which is level 4 autonomy that SAE defines. And then finally, FHWA provides a nationwide economic impact of about $28 million per year as a result of this final rule. So they have estimated, and the report is available. If you go to the Federal Register area, you'll be able to download that report and see how they came up with that number. So a couple of thoughts I wanted to share before the time ends here. And I'm just about through the slides, so we'll get into the Q&A here in a minute. I've said it before, I'll say it again. If you want to manage something, you need to measure it. And out of all the real methods here, probably measuring retroreflectivity is the most, you're going to be able to quantify what that retroreflectivity looks like. And if you do that over time, you'll be able to understand and manage pavement marking retroreflectivity, in my opinion, much better than some of these other methods. I've participated in consistent parameters and calibrated markings techniques, and I can tell you, they do have variability associated with them. It might be what your agency chooses to do, but you're going to have to live with the variability that comes out of that. And you might end up replacing pavement markings well before they really need to be replaced. The service life based on historical data is reliable if you have that data. I recognize a lot of agencies don't have that data. If you're a local agency and you don't have that data, your state might. So you might want to contact a state official to find out if they've been doing that, because your local agency is within that state. And I know there's geographic and environmental differences, from one corner of the state to another corner of the state, but at least you have something to start with that is in your geographic region. The service life, if you don't have it and you decide you want to establish it, it can be a time-consuming effort because pavement markings don't wear out overnight. Some last years, some last at least a year. It just sort of depends on what type of material you use, whether you install it in a groove, whether you've got lots of snowplow activity, lots of factors. So there's some thoughts on the MUTCD methods. And again, I don't have enough time to really get down and break the pros and cons down of each one of these. If you're interested in that, or you're thinking about implementing some of them and you just would like a sounding board, I'd be happy to do that. Now, I do want to share what I'm calling evolution of retroreflectivity measurements. And this is just sort of an educational piece, because I do think this is probably the best way to go about achieving compliance. And I want to be sure that you're aware of the latest technologies out there. So I've broadly, and I say broadly, I mean very broadly, broken them down into 3 different generations of equipment. The first generation is a handheld retroreflectometer. You can see the use of it on this test deck. Obviously the pavement markings are traverse here, but it's only to achieve accelerated wear of the pavement markings. This isn't what your road looks like, but you just rotate the retroreflectometer so it's parallel with the line that you're measuring. But this is a machine that you you set on the road, set it flat, pull a trigger, and instantly get a number. But it is a slow operation and it requires traffic control. This is what I'm calling the first generation of retroreflectivity measurement devices. The second generation is a huge improvement over the first. It's a mobile device, and this is probably the most used in terms of mileage of retroreflectivity measurements made today. It's a side-mounted unit. You can drive your roads at traffic speed, day or night, no traffic control needed, and it measures one line at a time. The third generation is kind of it's an upgrade of the second generation. And this piece of equipment you install on the front of the vehicle. Again, you can operate day or night. You can operate at any traffic speed, no traffic control needed. This one measures both lines. So if I'm on a 2-lane highway, I get the edge line and center line at the same time. And it also measures everything in the lane. So if you've got a shield, or if you've got an arrow or a stop bar or a crosswalk, you're going to get retroreflectivity of those as well. And I know those aren't in the final rule, but maybe crosswalk retroreflectivity is important for your agency because of all the vulnerable road user crashes that keep increasing. So I just wanted to go over that with you. These are the sort of what I would consider the most recent, in this third generation being sort of the most recent generation of retroreflectivity measurements. So there's some resources here I'd like to share with you. First of all is the MUTCD nighttime visibility website. There's a lot of information on this website about sign retroreflectivity, pavement marking retroreflectivity, roadway lighting, and that kind of stuff. The MUTCD website, I hope everybody's familiar with that. The MUTCD is free on this website and should be a site in your bookmarks for sure. FHWA held a briefing of this final rule, and there's a link to that webinar here as well if you wanted to listen to other experts speak on this topic. And then finally, what I'd like to share with you is the paragraph that is outlined in red. This comes from Federal Highway. So, and I don't have a lot of additional details yet. I'm still trying to get those, but you can see that federal funding is available to help support implementation of this final rule. I think that's very important for everybody. All right, so I've gone over certain things here today. I'm going to ask you guys a question to see how well you've been listening in. So here we go. You should see the survey on your screen, and I think we'll have 45 seconds to respond. Please select a button that you feel is the correct answer to the question, and I will share your results with you and see what kind of grade we get. Oh, I am so happy. Okay, I'm going to publish the results. Everybody was listening well. So here are the results. Now that you see them, I'm sure everybody's going to select B, but I wanted to just make sure that everybody understood the compliance date is 2026, and it's not to have all your markings at 50 or above. It's that you have a method in place designed to maintain your pavement marking retroreflectivity. So that's FHWA's way of providing maximum flexibility to agencies. All right, so we're going to go to the question screen, and I'm just going to put my contact information up here. If you'd like to shoot me an email or engage any other way, that would be fine. Okay, Ryan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, perfect. So a few of you have already submitted questions, so we're going to jump right in. If you'd like to submit a question, simply type your question into the Ask a Question box and hit the send button. So, what type of calibrated mobile measurement method do you use?
Okay, so for the calibrated markings technique, that idea is that you either measure or you have somebody measure for you if you don't have a retroreflectometer, a couple different lines, maybe close to your maintenance yard or close to your headquarters or close to whoever's office is going to be conducting the nighttime inspection. At night, with low beam illumination, an inspector in the vehicle first looks at those pavement markings, and they know what the retroreflectivity is of those pavement markings because they've been recently measured. And the idea is they sort of take a snapshot of the brightness levels of those pavement markings that they start the night with, again, that they know the retroreflectivity of. And then they do their inspection route with those snapshots in mind. And they try to remember, okay, I saw what a 50 looked like. I saw what a 200 looked like. Now I'm going to go drive my inspection route and try to judge the remainder of the markings I'm going to look at and compare those to that 50 and 200 that I looked at as the night started. It's hard to take a picture of retroreflectivity. The light levels play tricks with your eyeballs. A pavement marking of 50 with low beams might look marginally adequate. But if you turn your high beams on or you throw additional light at the pavement markings, they're going to look great. So it's really hard to take a picture of pavement markings and say, this is what a 50 always looks like. It depends on the contrast level. So that pavement marking might be on a brand new black asphalt roadway and it's got high contrast. It's going to tend to look better at 50 than a 50 would if it's on a faded asphalt road or even on a concrete road. So there's lots of factors that go into looking at retroreflectivity using a visual inspection method. And it's one of the reasons why there's so much variability associated with any of the visual nighttime inspection methods. I hope that helps.
Perfect. Does 3A.03 exclude roads with ADT of less than 6,000?
Yes, I showed that earlier. That threshold is a somewhat of a common threshold that the MUTCD uses. And so there was some attempt to maintain some consistency with other standards in the MUTCD. So that's where the 6,000 comes from.
Perfect. Let me see. How do you measure the quality of executed road markings in the contracts? Handheld measurement?
Okay, that's a great question. So that question goes to a little bit different than this, but very related. So after a contractor puts down pavement markings, how do you know that they put down quality pavement markings? Because that's an important piece of how long your pavement markings will last on the road. There's lots of different ways agencies do that, but one of the most common ways agencies do that is they require retroreflectivity measurements to be made anywhere from 14 to 30 days after the pavement marking was installed. And that window varies from state spec to state spec, and there's not a lot of national guidance on it. So there's a lot of variability in how that is handled. Some states don't do anything at all, but those that do require what we call initial retroreflectivity measurements. And the window is usually a few days after application to let the loose beads kind of wear off the lines and kind of let things settle out a little bit before what we call initial measurements are made. Some states have the inspectors do that type of reading. Some states allow the contractors to actually do that. Those states that allow the contractors to measure their own lines must also then have a third party randomly inspect the contractor's work. And there's agencies that go that route as well. So yeah, you can use a handheld, but most states tend to use mobiles for retroreflectivity measurements. Just doesn't require traffic control. It's a much safer way to do that. And the mobile equipment the pricing for mobile equipment is not as steep as it maybe once was when those units were first hitting the market. So that it's become within the reach of a local jurisdiction if that's the method they wanted to do, to go buy a mobile unit. They're easy to use. They're easy to calibrate. The industry's done a nice job of making them rather easy to use. And all the tests, there's several states that test these mobile systems, and they have all tested well. So it's not like one outperforms the other from my perspective. They all pass various testing regimens that states set up for them. So they're all more or less on equal playing fields as far as the performance goes.
Okay, perfect. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but for those questions we didn't have time to answer, we'll be getting back to you via email. And that concludes today's presentation. On behalf of Roads and Bridges, I'd like to thank ATSSA for sponsoring today's event, and of course, all of you for joining. Have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everybody.